photo is of Hill 190, which was one of the base camps we operated out of. Kathy, as I called him, was at the radio operator for the officer, Captain Lyle Johnson, who was a company commander prior to me. Captain Johnson took that position, was killed 3 days later, and so then, just by virtue of necessity, then Kathy became my primary radio operator. I usually had 3 or 4 at any one time. One was your company operator, which he was. Then a lot of times you had an artillery radio and an air radio, and then a battalion radio. So, excuse me, the further communications, it was difficult to have all those people around you all the time, but that's what it took as a company operating by yourself. But the casualty rate amongst officers in Vietnam was abnormally high in comparison to other wars, and part of that was because of jungle warfare, but we had a very cunning enemy who knew how we operated, and they could pick us out. I mean, nobody wore rank insignias or anything like that. There were no saluting or any of that sort of thing, but it wasn't too hard for them to figure out. And when somebody would walk to you with their hand out, you know, which were handing you the headset for the radio, that's a pretty clear indication of who everybody was.
You're the officer, yeah.
And radio operators were the same thing. They were there were a lot of casualties with them. As I mentioned, I had spent an extra year on the East Coast playing basketball, and everybody else had gone on to Vietnam. Well, rank, there's an appropriate rank for different positions, and a second lieutenant, which I would have been had I come across originally, would be a platoon commander. Well, being held there a year, then the natural progression for a second lieutenant was after 18 months in grade, you became a first lieutenant. So I actually became a first lieutenant going across to Vietnam, and I arrived there as a first lieutenant with too much rank to be a platoon commander, and no experience, and not enough rank to be a company commander. So what the colonel who was the battalion commander at that time, Colonel Love, decided that they'd ought to keep me in the battalion area for a while and help me learn some of the basics, which they did. But then when Captain Johnson was killed so precipitously, they were without any officers. They didn't have any left.
Wow. And
so the colonel made the decision that I should go ahead and take over Echo Company without any prior experience.
Yeah.
And it could have been very tragic, but I had staff NCOs and NCOs who were all battle hardened and tremendous people. And I may not have made a lot of right decisions, but one right decision I made was to listen to them and not try to be a John Wayne or even let on like I thought that I had a lot of knowledge. And once they realized I was going to rely on them and do the very best I could, they joined me in my effort, because it was, you know, it was mutually the best for all of us, because I was the company commander.
Yeah.
So I didn't have the rank to be a company commander as a first lieutenant, and that was another thing that was different. But then they formed the 5th Marine Division at Camp Pendleton, and in doing that, again, they had to have a bunch of officers. So they promoted 2,000 first lieutenants to captain, and because I was already holding a captain's billet or captain's job as a company commander, I think that was probably the main reason. Then I was promoted to captain with about 5 months in grade as a first lieutenant. Normally it's about 2 or 3 years. Don't ever ask people to do things you won't do yourself.
Yeah.
And because they'll sense that out in a hurry, and there's a fine line there, because you can't be on the point on the company. You can't be in the fire team in the front of the formation. But you're responsible for everything that those people do.
Sure.
And you have to have a style of leadership, in my opinion, to where you knew what they were facing and dealing with, to help you make decisions if it isn't their best best care, and I think part of it too was, it didn't take me very long after I got there to see it was a losing situation.
The situation in Vietnam.
Yeah, we weren't there to win that at all. We were in a defensive position, and and when I saw some of the things that the United States government did that were, in my opinion, were just totally insane. And I'm only confiding in my own thoughts, but I do know a lot of other people felt the same way.
Sure.
I just felt like, I had a mission. We were going to accomplish it the best way we could, but I was never going to expose kids to anything that I absolutely didn't have to, because I didn't have any idea of how we were going to be treated when we got home, but I didn't want to be risking their lives and losing cause either.
There's enough gunslinging as there is, right? We don't need any extra gung-ho, unnecessary stuff.
Quite frankly, the United States government, they could have cared less about us.
Is that how you felt?
We were, and I still believe it today.
Really, yeah.
And in reading the historical documentation, it was all about what is now today referred to as political correctness. It was a selective targeting of the enemy, while at the same time risking everything on the part of young Americans. The primary effort of the United States government at that time, and the Johnson administration, was to spare the lives of the innocent civilians in North Vietnam at the expense, a huge expense, and cost of American lives and American aircraft.
I guess, people might say worried about China coming into the war, and things like that, and so we want to don't risk provoking China, but
that in and of itself is self-defeating, and it goes back to what General Patton said in his movie that I referred to last night. War is all about killing people.
Yeah.
It's not about killing some people and not other people.
Yeah.
It just doesn't work that way.
Well, and as it kind of turned out, I think you guys were facing an enemy who had a lot of weapons from China.
Oh, sure.
And is it Kathy, I believe, mentions in his book, I've read it in many memoirs, and perhaps you experienced this yourself, you get into a firefight and you see the results afterwards and realize that guy's not Vietnamese, he's Chinese.
Yeah.
And did you ever feel that you were actually fighting Chinese as well?
Oh, absolutely. In fact, in my memoirs, I relate a situation which was up around Phu Bai, north of Hue, where we were attacked one night, and these guys were 6-footers.
Oh, so it might be in your memoir then that I remember reading about. Just not a lot of 6-foot Vietnamese out there. Yeah.
And they were entirely different, and they looked different too.
Sure,
So there, and the military documents indicate that too, that there were Chinese reinforcements in there. So it wasn't a matter, of us maybe angering the Chinese. They were there.
They were involved anyway. You expressed this feeling that the U.S. government really didn't care about us over there. Did you feel that at the time? Is that something you felt at the time in the field?
Well, not having had any military experience before, wasn't a definite thing. But I'm a country boy, and I know, if you don't feed the cattle in the wintertime, what's going to happen to them? And the analogy of that is when we didn't have a weapon that would work properly.
I can't believe this. I'm learning more and more about this. The M16.
Daryl Horn's book.
It's unreal.
I was reading last night.
Yeah.
He was talking about the same thing of all of the dead Marines laying beside guns
how does
that were
this happen?
jammed.
No, I've only learned about this recently, and I guess there was a congressional investigation. But I can't remember which memo. Oh no, I was talking to a vet last week. Early '66, M16s are jamming. Daryl Horn is writing his memoir, mid-67, M16s are jamming. I was reading another book, post-Tet, May of '68, M-16s are jamming. Over 2 years, one of the most basic weapons you guys have has this real problem. That it's hard to interpret. I mean, how do you interpret that? I mean, it's just
Well, the
that's
interpretation
insane.
for me, Preston, is that I'm totally convinced, unless you can show me otherwise. Um, it goes back to what President Eisenhower said about the military-industrial complex.
Mm.
Armaments are designed and they need R&D, and the D is in use out in a combat situation. There's any doubt in my mind that weapon in perfect conditions fires fine, but they never had it in a combat situation, and so we were the guinea pigs. And the proof of that was, for me, in the almost 9 months I had a rifle company, they came out twice, took all of our M16s and gave us new ones, trying to get one design that would work. And that led to a tremendous confrontation. The AK-47, and it was a Russian-made rifle, one of the finest weapons that was ever built. And so when we continued to have so much trouble with our M16s, plus the United States government began to ration us ammunition. You get so many rounds a month. Well, what in the world do you do on the 20th of the month if you're out of ammunition? Well, once again, back to my old country values. So I'm thinking, well, tell you what we'll do. We can capture all the weapons we want, you know, as we would overrun units or whatever. And so we would select the weapons that they had that were really good, like AK-47s, and we'd carry them. We just slung our M16.
I was just reading about this 2 days ago. And so it's interesting because, you know, up until pretty recently, you know, of course the United States had the greater firepower overall. But when it comes to the most basic weapon, the AK, I mean, you could practically bury the thing in mud and it's still going to work. M16 sounds like you get a piece of dust in the thing and it jams.
Well, and it fired so fast. 750 rounds a minute.
Good grief.
Think how many rounds a second that is. And, you know, in a perfect lab situation, that'll work, but it won't otherwise. And the thing that would happen is just a little bit of you know, carbon or soot or anything in the chamber itself where the round goes in would cause that round just to come out a tiny bit hard, and it was firing so fast it would yank the extractor ring off of the round, and then it would chamber another round right into the back of that round that was caught in the chamber. And then you had to take your pack off, get your cleaning rod out, put it together, hammer down through there to knock that round out. Then you had to have an extractor to use to get the one in the chamber that the extractor ring. But then you're dead, or it's over.
Well, I've never been in combat, but I'm guessing if the VC are threatening to overrun you, you don't have time for all this stuff.
Another weapon that they had that were excellent were M1 and M2 carbines. And I'm not sure where the carbine was made. I think it was made in Europe somewhere. But anyway, they were amazing, and they were light, and they had folding wire stocks and all kinds of things. And
so this must have been, I mean, mind-blowing. In addition to everything else, you know, some of these, I don't mean this in a crass way, but I mean, you know, so these peasants are coming at you in sandals, and et cetera, pajamas and sandals. But their weapon, day to day, is a superior thing.
Well, they weren't just peasants.
Right.
The North Vietnamese Army.
Right, yeah. So you've got the NVA as well. And so this is the sort of, you know, I mean, there are many other things that can be mentioned, but this is the sort of thing that just leads some of you guys to think, man, the guys back in Washington, D.C. just
but there were consequences.
There
were consequences for guys like me that tried to do something about it. And Jack, one of the guys in my memoir, the finest Marines I've ever known, Jack Johan, he was carrying an M2 carbine. An M2 carbine has a selector switch just like an M16. It would fire either semi-automatic or automatic.
Yeah.
The M1 carbine was just a semi-automatic weapon. He was carrying this brand new M2 that we had captured and folding wire stock and everything. And we were spread out in a formation across a large paddy area. And at that particular time, Jack, as a Sergeant E5, or we called a buck sergeant, he was a platoon commander. I mean, that's how short we were of officers, and that should have been a second lieutenant. But Jack's platoon was on the right flank, and I saw we were using a road there as our right flank, and I saw a Jeep or something come down that road, and I saw it stop over there. But it was far enough away I couldn't tell what was going on, and pretty soon the vehicle went on. Well, that night when we were digging in, Jack came to me and he said, hey, Skipper, he said, there were two colonels in a Jeep that came along there today. And he said, they looked out there and saw me carrying that M2 carbine, and they called me over there and they disarmed me. They took it away from me. Yeah. And said it was an illegal weapon. Well, it wasn't very long after that I got a radio message from my battalion commander and said there's going to be a chopper come out and pick me up the next morning. Well, I didn't know if that's what it was going to be about, but whatever. And sure enough, chopper comes in, I hop on and go back there. And so I walked in and the colonel said, and he was a real robust, profane guy, but he wanted to know what the blank was going on and that we were carrying unauthorized weapons. And so but he was a very, very good Marine. And I said, well, Colonel, we got a mission to do, and we can't accomplish it with the weapons that we're given. And I'm not going to risk my men's lives like that. And I'm going to use whatever weapons, that we need to, or you can find somebody else to do the job, Yeah. And he thought about it a minute or so, and he said, well, all right, you dumb SOB, just don't get caught at it again. But I had already previously expressed to him my concerns with the trouble we were having with the M16. So, but when you go back to the military-industrial complex idea, they developed the M16. They developed firecracker rounds for artillery. They developed flechette rounds for tanks and artillery. And in aircraft, there are all kinds of development. Sure. The real truth of the matter is, a military-industrial complex needs a war every so often to test their weapons. In any armed conflict, the civilian populace suffer collateral damage beyond description usually. Sure. It's happened in every war, and you imagine the carpet bombing of cities in Germany, and the untold, tens of thousands of people, innocent people who were killed. And so it wasn't a phenomenon to Vietnam, but this was an example of the collateral damage of that war. And this little guy was almost an orphan, but he was a survivor and just extremely intelligent. And so he somehow had been attached to our company before I became commander of it. But he lived in one area there west of Da Nang, and when we were in that area, he would show up. And he'd come and stay with us, and of course, we'd give him sea rations and to eat because, as you can tell, at 14 years old, he hadn't suffered from overeating. Right, yeah. But just the brightest little guy you'd ever meet. And so what he would do for us, and then I need to back up a minute. We didn't receive any foreign language training before we went over there. I would guess that less than 1% of the military people that went to Vietnam, at least in combat units, spoke Vietnamese. You learn different little phrases and stuff from them, and them from us. But a little guy like this, he didn't have any formal education of any kind, and he was just extremely good at interpreting. And so what I would do is have him help out in my communication with the civilian population. And we were given interpreters called Carsons scouts that were supposed to help us with that. Yeah. But it became pretty obvious to us that they'd been infiltrated by the Viet Cong. Yeah. And they couldn't trust them.
Now these Kit Carsons were former NVA who had supposedly switched sides or something like that?
I don't know
or-
where they came from.
Okay.
Uh,
Yeah.
There were so many things, you know, like back. I was a teeny cog in a
Sure,
great big wheel,
yeah,
and
yeah.
all I can tell you about is what I
Sure,
knew,
yeah.
and I didn't know where they came from. But they said, here they are. You're supposed to use them.
Your
Well,
Kit Carson Scouts. Yeah.
and if you said, well, we don't want them, they'd say, look, that's part of the effort here, you know.
Yeah.
And you know, as an example of that, those Kit Carson Scouts would be with us, and they got paid $20 for each set of ears that they would turn in, and $20 was a lot of money to them.
Yeah.
And so anytime that we were in contact and there were dead bodies, they were out there sawing the ears off, you know, which was in direct conflict with the Geneva Convention of Mutilation of Bodies, and direct conflict with our directives for U.S. military.
Yeah.
But it wasn't too long. I could see that, I mean, these people we didn't trust already, they were going to really be vicious if we took away the incentive that the South Vietnamese government had given them to make money.
Yeah.
So again, it set up a tremendous dichotomy of values in my mind.
And another element of something like insanity too, because I'm guessing once you've got a piece of, or you've got a couple ears that have been liberated from the person, it's hard to tell, you know, who they actually came from, right? I mean, are we always certain that these are VC? Are we always certain that these are
they'd
NVA?
love to add mine, I'm sure. You know, and so those were the kind of pressures, you know, under the surface you dealt with. You know, I didn't never confided too much in troops, but they knew. They could tell from looking at these guys, you know, just by the look in their eye. They hated us in a lot of ways, and they were there to transfer information. And the reason it was so important to be able to communicate with the populace was because they could tell you where the booby traps were. They could tell you where the dud bombs were, you know, all those sorts of information. But you couldn't rely on what these guys were telling them. And plus, by having them with us, if the local populace really knew who they were, they'd be scared to death to tell us anything. So, you know, it was...
Yeah. So you had these Kit Carsons who were supposed to be your interpreters and to help you navigate the local culture, but you were pretty sure you couldn't trust them. And so Huey, just go back to the image here, Huey, he became your interpreter, apparently hanging around with Americans. He'd picked up Marine English, I would probably. I'm not sure he's quoting Shakespeare to you guys.
Yeah, as Kathy said in his book, you know, he could cuss like a Marine drill sergeant, you know.
So so you would have him listen to the locals, or even listen to the Kit Carsons as they're interpreting, and then he'd tell you what the real story.
But we had to be careful with that, because if they knew he was doing that, they'd have killed him in a heartbeat. And that's why, you know, he's just a microcosm of the example of people that once the United States left and the country got overrun, what would have happened to them.
Of course, we don't know how things turned out for Huey, but the fear is that since he worked so closely with Americans, he became a target.
Yeah, you know, Sid and I, who is another character in my memoirs, we thought of some way of trying to get, you know, bring him back to the States with us, but the mass movement of so many military personnel back and forth and doing it so fast, it was very difficult to try to accomplish anything like that. You know, we were flown back and forth, and when I left Vietnam, according to some calculations, it's awful close, but I was almost standing in Cheyenne, Wyoming before I left Vietnam because of flying across the international date line.
Boy, that's a whole other theme. I mean, you're in Vietnam, and then almost immediately you're in Wyoming, and that must be surreal.
Yeah, that was. You know, I didn't realize it at the time, but you know, hindsight being 20/20. Like at the end of World War II, everybody came back aboard ship. At the very minimum, they usually had a couple of weeks to decompress, and but And I think a lot of it was to make the war more popular. I think they thought flying people back and forth was better for you.
Mm-hmm.
And but it wasn't. It was a horrible miscalculation.